effect, accusing me of a war crime. You can't say this about us. You've got to rewrite this in milder terms, which Churchill did. But the original memo was kept on file and was published by the official historians of Bomber Command in 1960, Webster and Franklin, both of whom had their very serious doubts about the bombing campaign. But what's interesting about it is this. At the end of March, Churchill's anxieties, which I suspect had been fueled certainly by Anthony Eden, but also by senior army officers who were going to and fro between conquered parts of Germany and back to London, and they were saying, "My God, you ought to see what's happened there and what we've done," and all those anxieties. And in fact, Hitch mentioned just that sort of reaction on the part of Dreiberg. But then, within 2 weeks, the first of the concentration camps was liberated by Allied troops. Neuengamme, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and the footage, the newsreel footage coming out of Germany showing British Tommies and bulldozers moving huge piles of emaciated bodies into mass graves, it so horrified the world, quite rightly so. The whole world was so disgusted and enraged by what it was seeing coming out of Germany that the debate about the bombing was, of course, and I think properly, dwarfed by it. It's one reason why it's taken so long, really, for people to be able to get enough perspective to separate things out. You know, like that game of pick up sticks, you get all the different, separate them out and just look at that part of the bombing campaign, the area bombing campaign, just by itself, and to examine it in our own consciences about it.
March 45 is a final time for Churchill to develop scruples, especially in view of what I said about the final solution. And I believe I'm right in saying that nowhere in any one of his histories, any one volume of his multi-volume history of the Second World War, is the final solution mentioned.
I had a feeling
it's a rather large omission from Churchillian historiography.
I had a feeling I wouldn't have to do a whole lot up here to get the conversation going. So I won't ask any questions, but I open the floor up to anyone in the audience. Can we start right there? And then we'll come down to the front row right here. And then we'll go over to this side right here. So those will be the first three, and then we'll keep going. Please.
Mr. Hitchens.
Sir.
Yes.
Apart from the morality of it, do you think that terrorizing civilian populations works?
Well, I think this was liberating a civilian population in part. I mean, we don't know how terrorized people were. We know that the Nazis kept a constant watch on people who appeared to be celebrating or fraternizing with advancing Western Russian troops, hanged them from the lampposts. Some of you may have seen the extraordinary film Downfall, recently made in Germany. Downfall. The regime kept on acting pornographically till the very, very end, and one can't overlook the fact, since you mentioned the word terrorizing, that Hitler's intention was not just to terrorize the German people, but if possible to have them destroyed as unworthy of National Socialism. He wanted a Holocaust, if you like, for the Germans. It seems to me, it can't be left out of the moral account. I don't believe we were trying to terrorize the population. I think we're making it clear that Hitler had brought them into a trap from which there was no escape, and that the revenge upon this maniac, this monster, would be something that the world would never, ever, ever forget.
Anthony?
I take the burden of your question to be about whether or not the bombing had the effect, really, of buckling morale. And it's a sort of an oddity, in a way, given the fact that the morale of the British people was stiffened, in fact, as well as in propaganda, by the bombing, that the conductors of the RAF's bombing campaign, Arthur Harris in particular, shouldn't have realized that there might be a sort of counterproductive effect. And it's really quite interesting to see that in fact happened in Germany. It certainly played into Joseph Goebbels' hands, because he was able to use the area bombing campain as an argument to the German people for resisting, saying, they're acting in this barbaric way. You can see they no holds barred as far as they're concerned. They're going to do anything to us, so we've really got to hang in there. He was cheered in the streets of Berlin. This is Joseph Goebbels being cheered in the streets of Berlin, and Berliner Schnauzer and all the rest of it, they weren't very happy about the Nazis either, until Harris's so-called Battle of Berlin, which started in late 1943, went through to the early spring of 1944, attempting to break the spirit of the Berliners, and it did anything but. So your question is a very interesting one. The hope that it would force the German population to turn on its government and tell them to sue for peace was an empty one.
Next question's here. Can I just suggest that you address questions to both of them, and I'm sure both of them will pick up on them.
Well, this is particularly to Professor Grayling with regard to the question of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Namely, the argument one hears, which is, I find, at least partially persuasive, is that these use of atomic bombs could be justified in reducing the casualties in the war against Japan because they shortened the war. I mean, it certainly seems clear they did shorten the war. U.S. was getting prepared for a mass invasion and anticipating, perhaps 100,000 casualties, and who knows how many Japanese casualties. So, what would you say about the moral calculus in that decision? Obviously, altogether maybe 100,000 were killed in the two bombings, but is that
still dying too?
They're still dying.
Still dying.
Yeah, but does that justify? I mean, can one make the case that preempted, maybe 500,000 being killed?
Well, in order to accept that point, we'd have to accept the premise that the Japanese weren't ready to make peace on the morning of the 6th of August before the first bomb went off. And that now, there's a very, very wide consensus now, that's just not the case. That for months beforehand, they'd been making overtures for discussions about peace, and that there were other motives on the American side for not agreeing to talks. They wanted, there seems to be a counter-argument to the point about saving lives, to keep the war going until the bombs were ready. You ask yourself the question, why did they drop two bombs? One might have been enough. Well, the answer is they were two different kinds of bombs. They'd kept cities relatively unbombed in order to see what the effect would be, turned down the idea of doing a demonstration. And also for months beforehand, solitary B-29s were sent over Japanese cities, very, very high up, 30,000 feet or 25,000 feet, to drone around a little bit over the city and then go away again, so that the Japanese population would get used to having these solitary, what they thought reconnaissance aircraft overhead. In fact, the Japanese called them Mr. B, sort of harmless bombers that came overhead and then went away. So that on the morning of the 6th of August, when there was a solitary droning B-29 above Hiroshima, nobody took any notice. Nobody was in an air raid shelter or anything else when that bomb went off. And there's a chilling description by Hirsch, I think, talking about seeing a line of soldiers with their hands on the shoulder of the soldier in front, all blind, because they'd all been looking up at the bomber when the flash happened, and their eyes were turned to liquid and ran down their cheeks like tears.
I see your point would be met by a demonstration bomb of the kind that the famous Dr. Edward Teller told me he had favoured. The same effect could have been produced on the 5th of August or earlier, if other things being equal. The only reason I can think, and I've never heard a justification for Nagasaki, as a matter of fact, is this, because the argument that it shortened the war was never made in 1945 in any cabinet discussion. We have all the papers now. Nobody said, let's do it to shorten the war. Some appear to have said, let's do it to impress Joseph Stalin, which, hey, is the reason we've destroyed Dresden already. Stalin seems to require a lot of immolated cities for his self-satisfaction. The other is possibly to deter the Soviet Union advancing into Japanese islands. But I think not until 1948 does anyone come up with the excuse, well, it shortened the war. So all of you who are out of the Pacific Theater should be grateful you got home early. It's a bogus argument, unfortunately. The other thing one could say is, well, it's completely annihilating. There's going to be no one in the Japanese officer corps after the surrender saying, but perhaps, we could have a comeback one day, the empire will rise again. They know, that's it. You really have lost this time. Again, this is an argument that I find myself very uncomfortable even rehearsing, because it's unquantifiable and possibly wicked, but these are psychological effects we take for granted that we didn't have in our arsenal at the time. Finally, not in the arsenal of the RAF or the USAF were rocket bombs, V-1s and V-2s, which started falling on London to a considerable extent in 1945, and in fact, it's universally agreed that British morale at that point was likely to crack, because people thought it was nearly over, and they couldn't stand the thought it was starting again, and this time, not bombers that could be shot down, but rocket bombs exploding without warning.